Welcome, this is Triaging Time, and I'm your host, Dan Luna. Today's guest is Brad Snyder. Brad Snyder began his professional career as an ensign in the US Navy, having graduated from the US Naval Academy with a degree in Naval Architecture. Through his distinction as the swim team captain during his final year, he earned an assignment as an Explosive Ordnance Disposal EOD officer. Brad deployed to Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2008 and deployed again 2 years later to Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. After 6 months of assault operations, Brad was severely injured by the explosion of a nearby improvised explosive device, or IED. Brad sustained complete vision loss as a result of the explosion, but he did not suffer any other lasting wounds. As a part of his rehabilitation process, Brad returned to the pool and after a few months of training, earned a spot on the US Paralympic national team for swimming. At the 2012 Paralympics, he competed in 7 events, earning 2 gold medals and 1 silver medal. His victory in the 400-meter freestyle occurred on the 7th of September 2012, which marked exactly 1 year from the day he suffered his vision loss. Brad medically retired from naval service in 2013 and 3 years later returned to the Paralympic Games, this time in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Brad competed in 5 events, earning 3 gold medals, 1 silver medal, and broke a world record that had stood for over 30 years. Since then, Brad has returned to his alma mater to serve as a leadership instructor for future naval officers. Brad has recently been admitted to pursue his PhD in public policy from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Brad, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Honored to be here.
I'm pumped. I got a big smile on my face. I'm so happy we have this moment going on right now.
Yeah, it's a good moment for sure. Despite all that's going on, it's a good moment.
It is. So as you know me, we're going to dive right into things. So life, leadership, volatility, and trauma. If we only had a few minutes with you, what advice would you share with us?
I think the thing I'm kind of currently trying to wrap my head around is really how to articulate the power of each individual moment. It's funny, I was sitting here listening to a bio like that, trying to think about what I would say to your first question, and my response is similar to the way that I start off my class with the midshipmen. Our day one, we start to talk about our heroes. Anybody who you've ever read the book about, whether it's Draper Kaufman or Winston Churchill or Grace Hopper or whoever else, and you read this book and you read all these things that person accomplished, and you think, wow, like, what an amazing person, what an amazing story. I could never hope to even achieve a small amount of that. But you have to look at those books as, that didn't happen all at once. It happened one page at a time, one moment at a time. And those people who achieved those really, really great, amazing things just did it one moment at a time. And I think that focus on the moment is really been important in my life, helping me navigate both some really difficult situations and some really great situations, from being hurt and losing my vision, waking up in the hospital and trying to wrap my head around what the rest of my life would look like blind. You can't do that all at once. The whole process takes a number of years, but you have to really focus on each individual moment. First, I need to figure out how to get out of that hospital bed. Second, I figure out how to go to the bathroom. Third, I figure out how to walk down the hallway to the nurse's station and so on. But each of those moments as individuals stack upon each other and then eventually wind up somewhere pretty cool. So even now today, given the kind of extreme circumstances we face, my goal every day is to really optimize every moment. If I'm in the gym, I really want to focus on being in the gym, making sure that I'm getting the best possible workout I can. Then I want to focus on getting the best meal I can. Then I want to focus on making the most of every meeting or paper that I'm writing or whatever it is. I try to really focus on where I'm at and what I'm trying to achieve. And my goal or my idea is if I've optimized every one of those moments, then at the end of the day, I can look back on the day and say, I I did everything that I could, and I can go to sleep feeling content, if that makes any sense.
It makes a ton of sense. I get part of what I'm hearing is presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think that it's funny. I recall this moment when I used to, when I was a younger athlete, to get like ramped up for a race. I used to listen to like really heavy like rock music, something kind of get me pumped up, and that way I felt like to reach a certain level of physical domination over my body or something like that, I had to get so jacked out of my mind. I could just overpower myself, or my mind could overpower my body, is the way that I sort of looked at it as a young athlete coming up. I remember this moment. It wasn't until after my entire able-bodied career and into the Paralympics. I remember being in London in the ready room, and I put in my headphones to listen to that same music and get ready for my race the same way I'd always done up until that point. And I remember for the first time, sort of like the sound of the crowd trickled in, and my heart rate started to elevate, and I started to get that that electric feeling across the surface of my skin, and I started to feel like this is a feeling like I hadn't really had in a while, and I think I'm like too amped. So I took the music out of my ear and just like had to, for the first time, really absorb the reality around me, but then like learn to manage it. And I felt like I achieved that in my races in London. It was kind of the first time I felt like I was able to fully embrace what was going on, understand all the external influences, but then go as far as to say I can manage that energy and vector it into a performance. And I think that was part of why I was able to race so well in London. But to your notion about presence was, I think it was a new level of athleticism for me, going beyond the pool and learning how to like absorb and manage that energy level in such an extreme environment was a really cool moment. And it had everything to do with presence. It wasn't shutting it out. It wasn't isolating myself from it. It was learning to exist amongst that energy and managing it to my benefit, if that makes any sense.
It does. Was this just something that you picked up on your own? Was this something that you learned from somebody else, a book that you read? Where did this idea of presence or focus or power of the moment really come from?
Man, that's such a hard question to answer, I think, because, at that point in my life, I was 28 years old, and I had, you read the bio, like I went to the Naval Academy, and that's not just a resume bullet. It's a really special institution where we do some really cool things, where, we have a really robust leadership curriculum, and we have an ethics curriculum, and we are knocked over the head with character and virtue and honor, courage, and commitment every day. And we have speakers like, Vietnam POWs come and tell us what it was like to be in a prison cell in Hanoi for 7 years, not knowing if they'd ever come home, and how they were able to wrap their heads around those incredible realities, to be in a classroom and to learn about Marcus Aurelius or Epictetus and the Stoic, philosophies, and all of that stuff, I think, crept into my brain and started to pop out when I needed it later on, whether it was in the hospital after my injury or in that environment. I think this notion of presence for me had a lot to do with like the Buddhist philosophies. My dad was sort of a strange fellow in that he read all kinds of stuff. I think, if you'd asked him, he would have said he was a Catholic, but on our bookshelf was all kinds of Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance and books like that. And I remember my dad he put the Book of Five Rings by Musashi in my hands when I was 11 and said, "This is the book that will unlock how you're going to be a really great swimmer one day." And I remember looking at the cover, and it's this samurai warrior with swords, and I thought, what is this book about swordsmanship going to have anything to do with swimming? And I think studying those things from a young age all kind of like got pushed into my head. And there was something about athletic performance, or the achievement of what some psychologists call flow, or getting into the quote unquote zone, where, like if you ask LeBron James what he's thinking about for that like buzzer beater shot, he's not thinking about anything. His mind and body are operating in complete unison. He's not thinking, pick up the ball and throw it into the hoop and like flick my wrist or whatever. He's just doing. He's just acting and he's reacting in a way that he's trained to do, but he's not actually thinking how to do it. I've always thought about trying to train that in myself in the athletic realm specifically. And I think, I've been able to achieve that in the water. That moment that I described in London, I think, was the first time that I wasn't doing something athletic when I was able to sort of, achieve that higher level of presence where I can acknowledge this really extreme reality and I can start to learn how to kind of, dominate the energy of that moment. I think you feel it in combat too, but I would say, in my limited experience on the battlefield, I don't feel like I ever was able to like dominate that feeling the way that I did in London. I think that I did okay in a combat environment and was able to function, but I never felt like I was dominating that environment. So it's an interesting space to be in, I think.
Where has that space brought you to today?
I think it's one of these things where, once you've sort of tasted it, you kind of want to replicate it as much as possible. And I know that I'm capable of that, but being able to push that sort of feeling of presence, or kind of full control over the energy of a moment, you want to replicate that in as many moments as possible. And I think there are challenges. I think it's to some extent, it's almost easier in a very high energy environment because there's just so much feeling to the moment. It's harder in a low energy moment. And I think these quarantine moments are great, where, all of the institutions that we're used to within our sort of sociological construct are kind of turned upside down. Going to the grocery store is like a big deal, and there's all kinds of angst and anxiety and uncertainty wrapping around our world. And this isn't a high energy environment; it's a low energy environment. But figuring out how to kind of become one with the energy of this moment is really, really difficult. And that's where I go back to this momentary focus, really focusing on, accepting each moment for what it is and finding the benefits of that particular moment, finding a way to be happy and content with that moment, optimizing that moment, and moving forward. Acknowledging that, some moments are high energy moments, some are low energy moments, but that same sort of full presence can apply across the board. If I don't sound too crazy right now.
No, not at all. I guess I'm curious right now, and I'm thinking about kind of going back to your career, the IED, and just what you endured through your recovery, and then to be a year later at the that's amazing. Was this part of your mindset, your philosophy while you were going through while that event was going on, or what was what helped you, or was this something that helped you get to that Olympic spot a year later?
It's interesting. I think the story goes a little bit beyond the 1 year. So, the injury was a big deal, and it was a lot to work through and figure out. But actually, the dynamic was made more complex by the fact that the previous 2 years were really dark years for me. In 2009, one of my best friends, the guy I went through EOD school with, was killed in Iraq. His name was Tyler. And he was, I think coming out of the academy and going into EOD school, like many of us who kind of roger up for this kind of work, I think, you look at a poster. I remember looking at a poster of what an EOD tech does and thought, wow, that is so cool. You get free fall and scuba diving and explosives and shooting and, all this stuff. And you're like, wow, this is a really cool career. That's what you think when I think you're 18 or 19. You're like, oh, this is cool stuff. And I remember going to a range for the first time and setting up some shots. And I remember going to a drop zone for the first time and watching people do it as a midshipman and thinking, I can't wait till I can go up in that helicopter and jump out and blah, 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 blah. When I got notified about Tyler's death, it was the first time that I really kind of had to wrap my head around this job is not just a cool poster. There are really devastating consequences to what this job entails. And that's definitely not on the poster, right? And it really changed. It changed me, and I don't. It took me years. It took me years to really fully understand that moment. And then, kind of in short order, a good friend of mine come out of the academy, committed suicide about a year later. And then on that deployment in Afghanistan, I learned that my dad died. And so, by the way, either strategically or unconsciously forgot to mention that I had a DUI right before my Afghanistan deployment, essentially could have lost my career. So I was just in a really strange space in that time. And what had gotten me through all of those sort of, shell shock moments was this notion of threat assessment. It's something they kind of teach us in school. And from an EOD point of view, it's like I'm in this scenario, right? And I have all these different things that could harm me. Like, let's imagine a combat scenario where I have the IEDs, we have Taliban fighters, we're in a structure that maybe is, some bombs have gone off and maybe the structure is a danger to me. Maybe I'm working with these Afghan commandos and I don't know if they're good guys or bad guys. So I've got all these threats. And this notion of threat assessment, I know you know this, Dan, I'm just doing this for the benefit of anybody who's listening. You take all these threats and you sort of prioritize them. You say, well, the building's good for now, so that's probably low priority. The Taliban fighters are a ways away, so they're not all that big a priority. What's really important is this bomb that's in the ground. So I'm going to work on that. I'm going to allot my focus to that. And then once that's rectified, I'm going to shift my focus to the other threats. And you just work your way down that list. And that notion of threat assessment can kind of like creep into your life. Like when you wake up today, what's the most important thing you got to get done today? Well, we're going on a trip, so I've got to pack my bags. And once I'm on the trip, then I got to do this other thing. I think once I got really into the throes of work in 2009, I just went into this threat assessment mode where I was just doing one task after the other for a period of a long time. And I hadn't really fully processed any of those things. Weirdly, blindness was the first time that everything stood still. And I couldn't go forward anymore. There were no more threats, right? There was no more tasks. I'm literally chained to this bed and there's nothing else to do. There's no more deployments. There's no more EOD. There's no more, lethal risks to mitigate or anything. It was just, I'm just there. And for the first couple of days, especially in the hospital, I'm having like these really crazy, wild dreams. I'm on all kinds of drugs. And so I'm having I'm having like my walkabout, man. I was walking in a desert for what felt like days, weeks, years even, like just walking in this desert in my dreams. And my conscious is aware of what's going on. My conscious is thinking all of this stuff through. And I think that was the first time that I started to kind of work through the meaning of all of those things, the meaning of Tyler's death, the meaning of my friend Tara's death, the meaning of my dad's death, the meaning of my own death. To some extent, I felt like I had died on the battlefield. And so I had time to sort of sit with those realities, contemplate the extent of what was going on and to drive some meaning out of it. And in the end, I kind of came away with it with a sense of peace. But then, that doesn't all change the fact that I'm still kind of chained to this bed. So the second half of this, we were talking about threat assessment a moment ago. The second half of it is that momentary focus or presence, as you described it. That's what got me through the blindness component of it. All the other stuff, the threat assessment and these other grave experiences helped me kind of establish the time and space to put into perspective and reconcile the blindness and to really be grateful for the fact that I was still alive. But then moving forward, learning how to adapt to blindness was all about the one moment. And it's sort of forced. I want to get out of the bed. I want to get out of this, cell, if you will. Like, I want to be able to get my movement back. But you can't move all at once. You have to, first I just want to sit up. And now, hey, do you think you could help me stand up? Okay, I'm standing. Oh, how about, can I walk? All right, hey, I'm walking. The physical therapist, you want to get on a treadmill? Yeah, I want to get on a treadmill. I wanted to get moving again. All right, now I'm moving again. Well, now how do I figure out how do I move in the direction that I want to go? And they give me that stick, my cane, and I start caning down the hallway. And the challenges like go from very, very basic to complex. Like now, how do I diagnose a traffic, a 4-lane freeway and figure out when is it time or when is it safe for me to cross the street? To think that I would be able to do that when I was back in the hospital bed would be unthinkable. But I did work up to those challenges just little bit at a time, moment after moment after moment. So it's kind of, rehab is structured to be that way on purpose. But I could very tangibly make progress through those movements and then look backward and be like, wow, look how far I've come. That's cool. So when you set your sights forward, it doesn't seem so like unthinkable to do things like go to the Paralympics or whatever else. And it sort of opened my aperture of ambition to say like, hey, I conquered this. Like, why can't I, go do this thing? Why can't I go to learn how to teach and be a professor? Or why can't I go to Princeton and get a PhD? And why can't I friggin' go to the moon or whatever? It opens up this kind of notion of what's unthinkable and what's not.
That was awesome. First, I really appreciate you sharing everything.
Oh yeah.
And two, I took a ton of notes. And one thing I just kind of noticed at the end was the forward thinking. And then almost going back to what you were talking about, or you mentioned Tyler in 2009, and then your friend a year later who committed suicide, and then the death of your dad, and then the DUI. So it's almost, I guess there was that forward thinking, and then to look at that spiral down, it was almost like you were stuck in the past. So like backwards thinking.
Yeah.
And just where you were stuck. And is it safe to say probably depressed as well?
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting to look back on those times. I don't know if anybody who's kind of admitted to those feelings, you don't feel like that in the moment, I think. The way I remember feeling in that moment was, it feels like a dark chapter, but I didn't feel like I'm depressed. Like I would never, I was having, like I would go out, like I'd go out with my buddies. I'd be out on Friday and I'd be having a good time or whatever. But I think there was sort of this, I don't feel like I do now. Like I'm so content with who I am now. I'm so content with my life. Every day the sun rises and I just feel this real deep sense of gratitude for every time the sun rises and every day that I'm here. That's not how I felt back then. I just kind of ran away from everything into work, and I would just go to work and I worked a lot. I worked that's all there really was. Home was a place to just go dump my bag for a moment and then go back to work. And again, I didn't feel depressed. I felt content at work. I liked working. I liked being on a team. I liked having a sense of mission. I don't create your own mission, but in the Navy, you don't have to do that. You show up at work and your mission's like wrote across the board and you have this Excel sheet that tracks your progress and all that stuff. So it was very easy to just kind of get lost in this, sense of duty. But then when I went home, I don't know that there was a whole lot of me around. And I think, again, I was really lucky, I guess, to have that experience of sort of having life force me to look at who I was and who I wanted to be. And the Paralympics was not like the solution. It was a step, and it was a great one, and something I was really grateful for. But there was this long process of being forced to look at who I was, who I wanted to be, and then kind of be happy with that in a way that I hadn't been when I was younger. And I don't think when you're younger, you don't feel like you need to because you're just moving so fast. But maybe it's good to, force yourself to take a stop every moment and kind of assess your situation and kind of ask yourself some difficult questions.
So I'm hearing some stoicism and some Buddhism in there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think I love talking about threat assessment because for me, threat assessment, I don't know if you guys have different words for it or whatever, but that's something we definitely teach in EOD school. There's like a Navy PowerPoint on this is how you do threat assessment. And we teach it to midshipmen now too. But it's cool because it's like that is a tactical framework of Stoic philosophy. Just this notion of working your way through one thing at a time, sort of acknowledging if you divide your focus across 43 things, you're not going to be good at any one of those 43 things. And especially in the training and execution of kind of combat oriented stuff where there are lethal consequences to every one of the tasks that you're doing, you can't afford to divvy up your focus. You have to focus on the thing that will potentially kill you, and you work your way down that list. I always thought that was a really cool framework. I love teaching it because it's got such a great tactical metaphor. But then when you apply it to your normal life, it can be really powerful. But then, as with many things, as I kind of described, it can harm you. You know, if you get lost in that and you lean too heavily on that, you have to, you can fall into that trap of just, you know, getting stuck in that every day. Like you're a factory. Every day I wake up, I go to work, I do the thing, I go home and I sleep, then I wake up and I go back to the factory and I continue just doing that work. I mean, in some ways there's nothing wrong with that, but you can go years, you can go decades without ever really wrestling with those difficult questions of who you are and what that means. On the Buddhist front, there's the notion of impermanence that's so big in Buddhist philosophy, and that's really learning how to disassociate yourself, not establishing such a strong emotional connection to all these big nodes in your life, kind of being able to kind of just work through, like that's especially relevant in the COVID world. Like I have this emotional attachment to my routine. I hear the midshipmen saying this, like, I really like being on the yard. I like being at the Naval Academy. I like going to class. I like seeing my friends. And the fact that those institutions are now removed causes them this dread, this feeling of I can't function the way I am now because it's not that other thing. But the Buddhist will tell you that all things are impermanent. All things in life are bound to die at some point or another. So if you acknowledge that, when the world implodes and you no longer get to go to class and you don't walk around the Naval Academy and you don't go to the grocery store or whatever else it is, you don't implode too. You just say, well, that was bound to die at some point, and now here we are in this new reality of which there are new variables and new things to think about, and I can thrive in this new reality just as much as I did in the other one because I'm not so tethered to all the variables that exist around me, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Brett, so there's a lot of your background with the combat experience and your experience at the Paralympics and your academic experience, and you're a very intelligent person and very well read. What's important to you about studying those things and kind of putting these pieces together? And I know, teaching is also very important to you. So I guess I'm looking for like the root, like what's really your driving factor to continue on this path of studies and further your degree, the PhD, and to continue for you as a student, and then to teach those lessons. What's at the root of that?
So I think for me, I have rationalized, or I think that what I like is this notion of real learning and development exists at the boundaries. And what I mean by that is, like, I use the metaphor of athletic training. Like if I really want to get stronger on the bike, I can't just go down there and spend 45 minutes going easy. I have to work really hard, and I have to do all these intervals at my lactic threshold, right? As much, I have to push as hard as I can for as long as I can to increase my muscles' capacity to, filter out carbon dioxide and get the oxygen to the muscles so they can keep functioning. I have to train at that boundary of my capability to expand my capability. I feel like learning is the same kind of way. You have to be at the boundary of your understanding to learn new things. So for me, it's all about pushing my own boundaries as far as I can go. And then I have found immense amount of reward in being able to sort of steward that experience for someone else too. And I remember very acutely what it felt like to be a young midshipman. coming to the Naval Academy out of my hometown, my very comfortable hometown, middle class, growing up, where I had a great growing up, but it wasn't an adventure. It wasn't, it was just nice. It was just nice to grow up, but I wanted to go to the academy. I wanted to have an adventure. I wanted to have someone force me to my boundary. And I think the academy was that kind of place. And I wanted to go have as many crazy experiences as possible. And I wanted to learn as many lessons as possible. And I have been able to do that. And I want to be able to kind of like pay that forward to the me of now who's coming to the academy. So they're going to go out and they're going to learn these hard life lessons, and they're going to go around the country and have their adventure. But I want to kind of empower that as much as possible. And there are things that I've learned along the way that perhaps I wish someone would have whispered into my ear. This notion of, momentary focus and be in the present was nothing that I ever really embraced back when I was a midshipman. I couldn't wait to go on to the next level any point. I couldn't wait to graduate so I could go to the fleet. I couldn't wait to get through EOD school so I could go to a mobile unit. I couldn't wait to go from the mobile unit to deployment because I wanted to be a post-deployer. I couldn't wait to so on and so on and so on. I think you work your way through a career where you realize, if you had just focused on the moment, you would have enjoyed those wickets a little bit more. So for me, it's about pushing the boundaries, but then helping other people push their own boundaries as well, so that we can all develop a little bit more understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be alive, and what it means to be a good person, I guess. And I think that learning occurs at the boundaries.
Just at a high level, just what are some of those lessons that you share with the mids specifically? Like, what are those kind of general topics, or those lessons that are important to you? Kind of, is there a theme to it? It's like, hey, when I sit down with the mids, like, this is what I typically share with them.
Yeah, I think it's that momentary focus. It's the kind of slow down and be patient. That's nothing that when I was 18, 19, 20, 21, I wanted to move at the speed of light. And once I was at the speed of light, I would say, how do we go faster? And I couldn't, every time I was somewhere, I was like, this is great, but I can't wait until I'm over there because it's going to be so much better when I'm there. And I kind of regret that point of view because I feel like I may not have been able to enjoy all of the different places that I was at as much as I probably could have. Now, don't get me wrong. I had a great experience at the Naval Academy. I had a great experience at EOD school. I had a great experience at the mobile unit. But I wonder, knowing what I know now, was I fully present for all those experiences? And could I have been a better officer? Could I have been a better teammate? Could I have been a better version of myself if I had just learned how to, pump the brakes every once in a while and just learn to be content with where I was instead of always being in such a hurry to get where I was going? And I think that's midshipmen balk at when I say that. They're like, well, what about goal setting? What about, how am I going to become brigade commander if I'm not operating at 110% of my capacity at all times? They kind of reject that notion offhand. No. I got to grind, and I got to grind hard, and I got to grind hard 24/7 if I have any hope of being the person that I want to be. And I think to some extent that mentality is healthy, and we screen for that. We want people who are ambitious. We want people who move fast. We want people who want to develop themselves, who can hustle and all that stuff. But at the same time, we also want people who can wholly focus on really important tasks. So I guess it's a little bit of a knife's edge there. You have to be able to do both. You have to be able to accept where you are, and be able to optimize the moment that you're in. But you also have to be able to look down the road and say, I think it would be good for me to go over there. And if I want to work from where I am now to over there, I'm going to have to set up these goalposts, these short, medium, and long-term goals to get me from point A to point B. But don't allow, I'd say in goal setting, don't allow those goals to obfuscate you or derail you from being able to adapt in any individual moment. If you don't always get to point B, maybe that's okay. Maybe you can just reallocate where point B is and now start heading in that direction instead, if that makes any sense. And I'm sure in your leadership coaching, you must address that as far as how do you adhere yourself to this set of rigid goals and establish metrics to measure your performance, but also give yourself the freedom to adapt to unique situations when things outside of your control influence your environment and potentially inhibit you from getting to point B. I think that's kind of the secret sauce right there.
Yeah. If you're okay, I'd like to shift gears just a tad. So I know
Sure.
You co-teach in Code of the Warrior. What have my favorite class ever? What has been some of your biggest takeaways from that class? So also, hey, just learning about past warrior cultures and then reflecting back on your own experience. And you said something about man, I wish somebody would have whispered in my ear when I was a midshipman. What's one of your biggest takeaways that you've gotten studying past warrior cultures, looking back at your career, saying, hey, I wish this was something else that somebody whispered in my ear?
Yeah, I think the Code of the Warrior is such a cool, I don't even know what to call it, like an institution, if it will. It's just in existence, it's a class, and it's a book written by Dr. Shannon French, but it's become so much more than that in my mind. And you and I think, had this experience in parallel, being in that room and starting to wrestle with these really interesting questions that I think we all think we understand until someone asks you, how do you define warrior? I just remember, I think for me, it really started to click into place when it was a midshipman presentation on how to define that word. And you're like, well, it would be this. And they're like, well, according to that definition, then that means this person is a warrior. And you're like, no, that person's not a warrior. And I just remember kind of really trying to wrap my head around what is and what isn't, and why is that important? I think when I was in high school, the towers came down and I wanted to serve, and I felt a sort of familial obligation to do that out of an honor to my grandparents who all served in World War II, to kind of protect my family. There was these things inside of me that I knew this was what I wanted to do. I knew this was noble. There was a feeling I had when I went to the Naval Academy. And it just felt like the right place for me. But I still don't really know how to articulate it all that well, but it's a strong feeling. And what's really cool about Code of the Warrior is that a bunch of other people with that strong feeling too are all starting to wrestle with, what does that feeling mean? And why is it noble to do this thing? And I think that is really important because, in essence, having those ducks in a row before you actually go into combat is of critical importance, because those definitions and those virtues will be challenged in the battle space. What the enemy is and what your relationship is to the enemy will be challenged, and your actions in that environment will kind of demonstrate or not demonstrate a certain virtue that you hold dear or that you don't hold dear. So before you go into that challenging environment, being able to ask yourself difficult questions about what it means to be a warrior, what it means to you, what it means to be working with this group of people who all have this purpose higher than themselves, being able to align with that is really important. And I think it's easy to put on a uniform. It's easy to put a rifle around your chest. It's easy to put on armor, kind of working through those tenets of what it means to be a warrior, what it means to represent your country, what it means to protect your society is a little bit harder. And I love that we have an institution built around helping people better understand that. And it's not something that existed when I was there. And I think I thought I understood what all those things were, and until I was in some really difficult environments in the battle space, where that was challenged, I kind of wish that I had this class, I think. Mm-hmm. I don't think that it would have changed anything. I think at the end of the day, I look back on my experiences and say, I'm proud of my service. I'm proud of what I did. But I think that I would have been gratified to understand it a little bit better if I had spent some time in the classroom like we do with these midshipmen and helped guide them through these incredibly difficult questions.
Brad, what you just said is basically what I'm trying to build on. This idea of pre-traumatic theory, pre-traumatic coaching, and Code of the Warrior really just holds a space to have those conversations through looking through the vehicle of past warrior cultures.
Yeah.
Now those questions come to the surface. Now that space is given for those individuals to think about those deep questions and to then, I believe, better equip them to then step on the battlefield and have a better understanding really of themselves first, and then have a better understanding of their environment, but really just to give space and then to hear from seasoned instructors like yourself, to hear somebody be vulnerable and to share like, hey, I didn't really, like this was, I was invincible until my friend was killed.
Right.
And then reality punched me in the face, and then I now faced it from a totally different lens. And to hear these stories and to, and so many other stories I've heard where things it's a slow spiral, and then that spiral just continues after, years of service or a career, where there's a divorce, where there's, a brain injury, where there's, you just start stacking this, and an individual levels of capacity then get stretched to the point to where serious injury then becomes a problem.
For sure. And to your volatility point, I've long thought that there was a really big part of the sort of how we nurture warriors missing. And I'll cite this, and I'm sure you have experiences like this, in the battle space. We're a joint world now, right? And you're not always working with just the group of guys that you trained up with. You end up working with all kinds of people. You work with folks who are, right out of boot camp, who just, a couple months ago were on their farm in Iowa or at the beach in Florida, and now they've got 80 pounds of armor on and they're walking around in Afghanistan or Iraq or something like that. And you can see the way that person looks at that environment, and maybe the way that you look at that environment or the people around you look at that environment. And for me, I think there was a really strong, there were some situations where, two different people from two different nurture backgrounds could look at the same scenario in completely different ways. Mm-hmm. I.e., we went to this little outstation in the middle of Afghanistan somewhere, and the guys I work with were like hell yeah, we're going to go do some damage and we're going to get at these guys. The same person, a different person looking at the same reality was mortified, to the point where they wouldn't come out of their tent for days on end. And so I think it's in the traditional framework, when we talk about Code of the Warrior, I think there's always been this mentality, some people just don't have it, right? So some people just don't have the fortitude or the mental capacity to look at a lethal situation and say, I'm going to lean in and move towards that situation, as opposed to cower and fall away. But I think there's a strong nurture component to that too. And I've been in that situation where I looked at that person and thought, how unfair is it that this poor, by all intents and purposes, kid was uprooted from a cornfield in Iowa or the beach in Florida and just given this crap, yelled at a bunch and made them do a lot of push-ups. And now all of a sudden they're in Afghanistan with someone shooting at them. They're like, we didn't equip that person to navigate that reality. You know what I mean? On the flip side, within the special operations space, we almost over-equipped to some extent in some respects for the combat-specific environment. So I thought, it is possible. Somehow we are doing this nurture thing right for some people, and we're failing others in that same space. And maybe it's a resources thing, maybe it's not, but I don't understand it. But I know Code of the Warrior is a great start to figuring out how do we do. And I think you're on the right track too with this pre-trauma counseling or coaching. I think, in that we need to do a better job of that for a lot of folks who are thrust into really difficult environments, who aren't always ready And I'm not convinced that it always means that that person just quote unquote doesn't have it. You know what I mean? We got to find a way to give it to them. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, 100%. Hey, Brett, as our time comes to a close, how would you summarize everything that we've covered?
I would say, kind of going back to the beginning, I think we covered really, in my mind, two important constructs. That notion of threat assessment and this way of sort of looking at all the variables that we're facing in any given moment and learning how to prioritize, or your word, triage those variables and start to kind of allot our singular focus to one thing at a time is a really great framework to use to navigate crisis situations, difficult times, adversity, whatever you want to call it. But I think within my own narrative, I've acknowledged that sometimes over-relying on that framework can get you into trouble, because there are some, more significant implications to this notion of identity or trauma or emotional connection or emotional tethering to different things in our environment. So there must be a better way, or there must be a space for us to sort of wrestle with some of those existential questions. And for me, being able to focus on individual moments and kind of break things down into bite-sized chunks has been really important for me to wrestle with some of those grander questions, to kind of, work through the death of my friend, or to work through the death of my father, or to work through my own adaptation to blindness. Oftentimes there was just allow everything else to fade away and really focus on this individual moment. And by stacking those moments on top of each other, I've been able to kind of slowly reconcile some pretty big things. And I can say for certain that the feeling that I have in my heart now is so much more whole, so much more content, so much more fulfilled than I was, 2 decades ago, working in the Navy as an EOD officer. So that's not to say I was doing a shitty job back then. It just is to say that, having been able to work through those things has been really cathartic in my current life.
That was great. Brad, do you have any final thoughts?
No, my final thought, I guess, is I'm really excited for your journey in this space, Dan. Kind of talking about some of the things that we've talked about, specifically that pre-trauma coaching, and kind of taking these feelings and these experiences that, you have had and that I have had, and the folks that you bring onto this show that have had, and kind of working through those experiences, working through those lessons learned, and sort of distilling that down into something that's digestible sort of en masse, I think is a really noble effort. It's a really great contribution, and I'm excited to see where this goes, and I'm looking forward to learning from you on this journey as well. So I'm honored to be a part of this, but I know it's going to go in a lot of great directions, and I'm excited to kind of participate.
Thanks, Brad. I really appreciate that. And I know we'll do plenty of things in the future, so I know where you live. So,
yeah, exactly.
So we'll definitely do this again for sure. Thank you for your
sure.
time today. I know you have a lot of stuff going on, so I really appreciate you making the time to be here. Thank you.
Oh, man. You're always a priority for me.
Thanks, brother. Well, Brad, thank you. Thank you for joining us. If you know someone who can get something out of this conversation, please share this video with them. And of course, subscribe, advertise for me, and
you got it, man.
It's not about myself, or it's not about Brad, or it's not about some of these other guests that we've had. It's really about just trying to create a community to share this, and then specifically with the YouTube channel, just a site that you can go to for different informational sources that'll be there, and hopefully help you on your journey wherever you are at on that. And remember, you don't manage time, you manage yourself, and leadership starts with you. Thank you.